At least as far as North America is concerned, Motorola's target audience, or at least the people who tend to buy their stuff the most frequently, are older men. And that's fine, but that's not necessarily what you can rely on when you want to grow as a company. And that's what Motorola wants to do, and that's why a device like the new Motorola One Action exists. It's a weird smartphone, sort of like the other devices it's put out fairly recently, but that's what makes them interesting, and that's what Motorola hopes will attract a younger, more globally thoughtful audience. So let's take a closer look. Now, right up front, I will say that the One Action does share quite a bit in common with the Motorola One Vision that we saw earlier this year. It has an octa-core Samsung Exynos chipset, making it one of the few non-Samsung devices out there to use Samsung's own silicon to power it. We're also looking at a 21:9 display. That's meant for a more cinematic approach, and we've seen it in devices like the One Vision, as I've said, and the Xperia One. As we see this kind of super widescreen content become more popular, people are going to want more of these screens, but the design here, especially with respect to the screen, does have other benefits too. Motorola told me that the narrower design of phones with this super tall aspect ratio screen are actually a little more comfortable for women and younger people to hold too, which is exactly what you want to keep in mind when you want to grow your business. It certainly doesn't hurt that it's a pretty good looking screen. It runs at Full HD+, and it stretches 6.3 inches across the face of the device, complete with a hole. Now, Motorola went with a hole here instead of a notch because the way they see it, when you're watching something that immersive on a screen like that, you're less likely to pay attention to the corner. So even though that hole is a little bigger than the notches you might see on Motorola phones, it's going to be less noticeable. The rest of the basics are pretty much in line with what you'd expect from a mid-range device. We're looking at a 3500 milliamp hour battery, 4 gigabytes of RAM, 128 gigs of storage, complete with an external slot so you can augment that storage even more if you need to. And it does run Android 9 Pie, complete with Motorola's generally subtle software flourishes. And that's where we do kind of have to dig in a little bit more. Motorola's Android One devices have usually stuck in line with Google's Android One program, which has specific criteria involved for software updates and how clean the software is actually going to be. Everywhere outside the United States is going to get a Android One powered Motorola One Action. If you're in the US though, Motorola feels that its own software actually offers a lot, and since it has a lot more experience shipping devices with that software in the US, well, we're getting Motorola's take on Android, which, to be fair, is still plenty clean and actually really nice to use. Really though, the big draw here is the camera, or the cameras, I should say. There are 3 of them here, and they each do something a little bit different. I only mention this because we've seen triple camera setups before, and they generally skew towards one of a handful of different types. Sometimes you get an ultra wide, sometimes you get a zoom in there, but it's usually a pretty set mixture of lenses that give you a little more flexibility than what you might be used to. The One Action is a little bit different. The main camera is a 12 megapixel sensor with an f1.8 aperture and phase detection autofocus, and in my experience, limited as it may be, it actually churned out some pretty nice shots. The secondary camera is a 5 megapixel sensor that's almost dedicated to just gathering depth data, so you're able to take portraits that actually do a pretty good job of separating your subject from its background. The third camera really isn't for photos at all. This is the camera that gives the Moto One Action the action in its name. Motorola is kind of looking at it as a sort of a GoPro situation that's happening in the back of its smartphone. And what's really interesting about it is Motorola knows that even though they tend to look pretty bad, Motorola knows people generally take a lot of video with their phones being held upright or in portrait, and that's less than stellar for everybody involved. So that's why they've actually mounted the video sensor here 90 degrees off axis. It's actually mounted horizontally. So even though it looks like you're doing something wrong on your phone, the moment you stop recording and look at what you've captured, well, you're getting the full wide angle effect that stretches across the entire screen. This is a fascinating and, yes, admittedly very weird approach to smartphone videography, but it's also one that I think is going to come with a bit of a learning curve, one that might be a little steep for people who've never really thought about their cameras before. If you're starting up the camera and just want to shoot a video, aren't you going to look at your phone screen when only a sliver of that screen is taken up by the field in front of you? And aren't you going to think something's wrong? I certainly did the first time I tried it. Motorola says there will be some setup information that will make that process more clear to you before you get started, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for people to just sort of take a little more time than they might normally to get used to a feature like this. For the younger audience Motorola is trying to go after, that might not be such a bad thing, but it is, if nothing else, a clear sign that Motorola has really interesting ideas and is willing to buck the conventional wisdom when it feels appropriate. And really, that's kind of what the new Motorola is all about. For the longest time, its only real mission in life was to turn a profit. And now it's doing that. It has to figure out how to grow profitably. With the Motorola One Action, Motorola is basically saying, well, let's reach outside our comfort zone. There are people out there with needs that we've never really tried to meet before. Let's see if we can't cook up a relatively solid mid-range device that doesn't cost a ton of money, that'll knock their socks off in some very specific ways. Fortunately, it won't be too long before you get a chance to start using this thing if you're outside the US anyway. It's gonna be available outside the US on August 16th, but if you're in the United States and you're really curious to see what this new Motorola is all about, well, you're gonna have to wait until sometime this fall.